To snip or not to snip? Today I'm going to present on the effects of male circumcision on sexual function and satisfaction. But first of all, what is circumcision? Circumcision is the surgical removal of the human foreskin from the glands. Typically this is done by incising the foreskin, removing the adhesions between the foreskin and the glands, and then finally cutting off the foreskin. It's one of the oldest procedures in human history, and the WHO estimates that about 1/3 of men worldwide are circumcised. Now, the penis is a really sensitive organ, so it kind of makes sense that there's a lot of research about whether there are any adverse or negative effects associated with circumcision. And even though there's been a lot of research done, there's still no real scientific consensus about whether or not there are adverse effects associated with circumcision. And that's sort of what I'd like to talk about today, particularly with reference to this study titled Adult Male Circumcision, Effects of Sexual Function and Sexual Satisfaction in Kisumu, Kenya. However, before I present anything about this study, I actually need to tell you about an earlier study, which is titled Male Circumcision for HIV Prevention in Young Men in Kisumu, Kenya, a randomized controlled trial. In this study, they were interested in whether adult male circumcision was an effective HIV prevention technique. They recruited participants who were male, 18 to 25 years old, residents of Kisumu, Kenya, uncircumcised, sexually active, and HIV negative. They recruited about 3,000 participants, and then they put them in two groups randomly. The first was a control group that remained uncircumcised, and the second group, which was about 1,391 men, were all circumcised. And then over the next 2 years, the researchers performed regular follow-ups with them to test their HIV status. However, after 2 years, they had to stop because they had found something pretty remarkable. Of the circumcised men, 2.1 of them at the 2-year mark had contracted HIV. On the other hand, of the uncircumcised group, 4.2% of them had contracted HIV. And given the sample size, the researchers concluded that the circumcised group was 60% less likely than the uncircumcised group to contract HIV. And what this meant was that it was unethical for the researchers to allow only one group, not the control group, to have this intervention. So they had to stop that first study. However, remember how I said that over 2 years they had regular follow-ups to determine their HIV status? Well, at those follow-ups, the research also interviewed all the men, and they asked them questions about sex life, sexual dysfunction, penile sensitivity, orgasm, sexual pleasure, number of sexual partners, all sorts of things about their sex lives. And because they had both a circumcised and a control group, this data became the basis for the study that I'd like to present results on. Just as a reminder, titled Adult Male Circumcision, Effects on Sexual Function and Sexual Satisfaction in Kisumu, Kenya. So one of the things that the researchers wanted to do was compare the two groups, and specifically compare the sexual function by circumcision status. What they found was that at the 2-year mark, there was no statistically discernible difference between the two groups when it came to inability to ejaculate, premature ejaculation, pain during intercourse, erection difficulties, and sexual dysfunction overall, which incorporated the last four categories. However, they didn't simply compare the two groups of men. They also had questions that were specifically tailored to the circumcised group. This is just an example bar because I want to tell you how to read the graph a little bit. The bottom bar, the gray one, represents the bottom bar represents no opinion. The two green bars represent a large or moderate decrease in sexual satisfaction. The dark blue bar represents no change in sexual satisfaction. And the two light blue bars represent a large or moderate increase in sexual satisfaction. So as you can see, when it came to penile sensitivity, almost 70% of the men, which is represented by those two light blue bars, said that their penises became more sensitive following circumcision. The dark blue bar, which represents about 30% of participants, said that there was no change in their penis sensitivity post-circumcision. and a very small minority of the men, represented by those two small green bars, less than 10%, said that their penises became less sensitive. You can see that those results were reflected with reference to orgasm ease and also ease using a condom. The vast majority of men were saying that their sexual satisfaction in these categories had increased post-circumcision. Now, really interestingly, the researchers also asked them, how protected do you feel against sexual diseases post-circumcision? And overwhelmingly, the participants said that they felt more protected. And that's about to become really key when we think about the conclusions, so hang on to that. The researchers concluded that adult male circumcision was not associated with sexual dysfunction, but that circumcised men could be expected to report benefits associated with sexual pleasure post-operation. And this was really amazing. There really hadn't been any studies that showed these sort of results. At the time, there were studies from Korea, Denmark, and Australia that showed that there were negative or adverse effects associated with circumcision. And there were studies from the US, the UK, and China that showed that there were no negative or positive effects associated with circumcision. But like I said, there was no one saying that there were significant positive effects of circumcision. So how do we understand those sort of results? Well, it goes back to this question: how protected do you feel against sexual disease? In Kenya, 1.6 Kenyans are infected with HIV, which is about 5.4% of the population. It also makes Kenya the country with the 12th highest population of infection. However, only 64% of Kenyans are on antiretroviral treatment, and as a result, circumcision is an increasingly popular prevention method in Kenya and other African and Asian countries, recommended by the World Health Organization, CDC, and UNAIDS. I do want to note, even though it's a little bit tangential, that even though I presented research that showed that circumcision was an effective HIV prevention technique, there's also research that disputes that. But the real question here is, what is at stake for the participants? So, knowing what we know about Kenya, that HIV is a really prevalent public health issue, it makes sense that the participants are probably concerned about their HIV status and the HIV statuses of people around them. And we know that the circumcised group reported that they were less afraid of sexual diseases after circumcision. And it makes sense that if they viewed circumcision positively or potentially saving their life, then they might think that circumcision was conferring other sexual benefits as well, including an increase in penile sensitivity or better orgasms. In terms of the future direction of this research, I think it's important to realize that you can't separate the cultural and social context of your participants from the scientific evidence. So I think that a meta-analysis of relevant circumcision studies is really important, particularly with a focus on regional attitudes, cultural norms, and stakes. I also think that there should be a focus on replication of results. So the study that we talked about from Kenya, could you find those same results if you replicated it in Denmark or Tokyo? And finally, I think that in a lot of the scientific literature, there's room for incorporating a bigger evolutionary perspective, because that's something that's really relevant when it comes to circumcision research. From an evolutionary perspective, almost all mammals have some sort of foreskin, or often in animals it's called a sheath. And in a lot of animals, this sheath has a really clear purpose. So for koalas, it contains bacteria which is necessary for reproduction, and in rodents, the length of a sheath is correlated with urinary marking behavior. So this raises two really fundamental and opposing questions. Is the male foreskin an example of natural selection if it confers some sort of sexual benefit? Alternatively, if we're at a place in society now where we don't need foreskins anymore, then is circumcision an example of cultural evolution? The real takeaway here is that circumcision research is really interesting, incredibly conflicted, and that there's a lot left to be done, particularly where it comes to cultural context and evolutionary perspectives. Thank you.